Chapter 7b, The Master's Birthday. Once breakfast was finished, the dishes and plates cleared away, the long table scrubbed clean of crumbs and drips of dry porridge, Peppercorn and the boys of his crew took the opportunity to share with the skipper a little more detail of the events of the past weeks, telling of the different treasures they had returned from the lake's bed. Being phlegmatic of nature, not given to undue excitability, the skipper listened in attentive silence, puffing thoughtfully upon his pipe and issuing only the occasional along with a cloud of aromatic smoke. Ulrich, on the other hand, the second youngest of the skipper's boys, had excitement enough for them both and a good deal left over to spare, and he listened with great interest to the details of their incredible tale, eyes wide in astonishment, showing particular interest in the description of the dragon, and asked many questions as their tale unfolded. Of course, he had heard the story of Smorg and Bard the Bowman many times before, as had all those who lived in Laketown, but he had never in his wildest dreams imagined there was any truth in it. "And did the dragon really breathe fire?" he asked, after establishing the creature's established height, length, wingspan, number of teeth, length of claw, etc., etc. "If ever he did," answered Peppercorn, "he does not now. When last I saw him he was rather waterlogged." The missus too listened intently to Peppercorn's tale, with especial interest as he recounted the events at the covert, tutting disapprovingly with every new detail. Meanwhile, Elisanda and the skipper smoked their pipes, Elisanda sitting at one end of the table, while the skipper sat pensively at the other, brooding somewhat and eyeing the mage warily. "I've told you many a time, Peppercorn," the missus remonstrated, "you're like to end up at the bottom of the lake yourself if you don't take more care. You know better than to go gallivanting about the lake in the middle of a storm. I ain't never seen such filthy weather." "The good lady is of course right," agreed Elisanda, smiling at the missus, "but the violence of this particular storm was such that I suspect there was more to it than the natural workings of the elements alone. Something unearthly, perhaps magical even." "Magic?" said the skipper in unveiled disbelief. "We don't need none of your magic round here, thank you very much." And he folded his arms resolutely across his broad chest. "Dark magic?" asked Dimmock, upon whom it was beginning to dawn that they had gotten themselves mixed up in something worrisome. "For someone who but days ago had scoffed at the mere mention of magic, Master Dimmock, you seem very ready now to look to it for blame," pointed out Elisanda. Dimmock gave no answer, but reddened a little under the smart of the mage's gentle but astute rebuke. "Since you ask," continued Elisanda, "yes, I believe it was what you might call dark magic, or, more accurately, magic employed to dark ends. It took all my knowledge of enchantment to keep us from being swallowed up in the waters." "Well, I'll be," exclaimed the missus, who, uncharacteristically for her, could think of nothing better nor more to say, while Hildreth simply raised her eyes to the heavens and touched the charm that she wore pinned at her throat. "'Tis not unusual for the lake to be so turbulent at this time of year," the skipper mused. But even he had to admit the storm of the previous day and night had rivalled any others he could remember for savagery. "At least you returned in time for the festivities," added Allard, enthusiastically, once Pepper had finished his tale. At first Peppercorn did not know what he meant by this remark, and then the penny dropped. They had lost track of the number of days they had been out upon the lake and so had forgotten. Today was the day of the Master's birthday celebrations. "And on that note, we must bid you farewell," said Finian, scraping his stool upon the kitchen floor as he stood to take his leave, "for Furman and I have some pressing business to be about." It wasn't until he crossed the kitchen to give his mother a kiss that Peppercorn realised Finian and Furman were dressed not in their workaday clothes, but in their holiday best. "Some pressing drinking, more like," laughed Farron as the twins moved toward the door. "The only business these scoundrels are wanting to be about are Felicia and Handa," chuckled the skipper, referring to the sisters who lived and served ale at the Dragon and Duck on Pleasant Hill. Judging by the blush that immediately coloured the brothers' cheeks, it would appear that their father had hit the nail on the head, so to speak, but the smirk was soon wiped from off his face when the missus jabbed a reproving elbow into his ribs. "Well, that's that then. Looks like we'll not be leaving Laketown today," observed Dimmock, who it should be said did not sound too disappointed about the fact. "Even if we could sail the farthing back out onto the lake, which is doubtful, what with all the other boats and vessels that will be in our way, we certainly could not do it without being noticed of the provost men." "We do not want people asking questions of us at this point," agreed Elisanda, who was yet to find the treasure he sought and anxious to be back out on the lake unhindered. It was inevitable that their continued attendance at the postern would be missed, that their activity would be noticed and their comings and goings draw unwanted attention, not only to themselves but to their enterprise too. It was inevitable that people would ask questions and that those as didn't have possession of the facts would answer them in whatever way seemed most likely to them. "Rumours are already a-growing," said the skipper, "helped not a little by Grubb, who is mightily put out by your absence, Pepper." "I bet he is," said Giles, Pep was the only one as ever did any work on that boat. Probably he's having to get his own hands dirty for a change, agreed Baldwin. Whether he is or whether he isn't, continued the skipper, he's telling all kinds of tales about your exploits to just about anyone who will listen. Indeed, it had not been long after their leaving the city for the words dragon and treasure to be whispered behind rough hands and into foaming tankards in many of the snugs of Laketown. How word had first got out, which one of them had not been as circumspect as they could have been and let slip an unguarded word, didn't really matter at this point. What they did know, what everyone in Laketown knew, was that the provostmen had made it their business to hear of such things, to gather rumours and collect gossip. In this way they were able to ensure that when money came to any of Laketown's residents, that they relieved them of a portion of it, some to augment the master's coffers, a very little to grease the palms of their informants, and of course some to swell their own purses. Indeed, if the existence of the treasure were ever to become common knowledge, it would not take long before there was not so much as a brass penny of it left, and you can bet that if Grubb, or anyone else for that matter, was spreading rumours of treasure, they will have heard about it. Needless to say, Elisande did not wish to raise any more eyebrows, nor any more suspicions for that matter, than was necessary, for he did not want all their hard work thus far frustrated or undone completely, not before he had the magic talisman in his keeping. So it would appear that the Farthing and its crew were trapped, for now at least, and until they were free to leave the city once more, they would have to resign themselves to a day of festivities and celebration instead, content for now that the treasure was safe behind the fortified gates of the skipper's storehouse. Instead, they would set off toward the Sunstreak in search of entertainment, and didn't they find it? I'll say they did. They stepped out a little after mid-morning to find that the weather had taken a turn for the better. The mist had burned off with the rising sun, and the lake lay calm and still beneath a blue sky. Perfect conditions for the biggest feast day in the Laketown calendar. For the people of the city, the feast of the Master's birthday was the highlight of the year. By some dubious coincidence, it fell on the exact same day upon which, for the past 1,000 years or so, the good people of Laketown had been wont to celebrate the feast day of Bard the Bowman, he of dragon-slaying fame. And though now these two auspicious figures, the Master and the Bowman, shared the day between them, for the past many years, slowly but ever so surely, the Master's celebrations had somewhat eclipsed those of the ancient Bowman, until that august tradition had been completely forgotten, save but for a few of the eldest residents of the city. Needless to say, the children and youths of Laketown knew nothing of the traditions of the Bowman's celebrations, and what little knowledge soever they had of Bard came from nursery rhymes and fairy stories. Still, the day of the Master's birthday was much anticipated and looked forward to by both young and old alike. It was a day when all labour ceased, except that labour necessary for the business of roasting meat and pouring ale, not to mention the playing of jigs and reels. It was a day when the good and the great of Laketown took to their vessels, or on show in all their splendour and finery, rubbing thwarts, if not shoulders, with the artisans and craft folk, as well as the workaday labourers and fishing crews, all the lowly and humble of the city, not to mention ragged and reeking. It was a day on which the whole city, indeed the whole lake, was alive with excitement and awash with holiday humour. All the ships and skiffs, the tugs, tubs, cogs and launches, the fishing boats and barges of the city, all came out at once onto the lake to enjoy the day's revels. Indeed, it was as if a second city of wood had sprung out upon the lake, extending from all the city's harbours and moorings, so great was the amassed number of ships, boats and floating vessels that joined the revels. A flotilla so dense that in places you could walk half a mile or more across the lake's surface, simply by stepping from one deck to the next. Above some of the boats, square sails had been raised like canopies to shelter those below from the weather, whatever the day might bring, be it sun or rain. It really did not matter. Flags of every colour and design flew, and pennants alike were strung between a forest of masts. Lined up outside the main wall of the haven, at the centre of the great congregation of boats, were the Master's state galleons, 7 in all, large, square-rigged, triple-masted vessels, fashioned upon the sea-going galleons of Edhelland, anchored broadside to broadside and lashed at the gunwales to make a floating citadel. These were majestic vessels of overlapping oak planks, wide in the beam, deep in the hull, and upturned like a crescent moon in the bow and stern. Tall multi-decked castles adorned both fore and aft, ornately carved, brightly painted, lavishly gilded and magnificent in a way that reflected the wealth and greatness of the city. The pride of the lake was their flagship, the Master's preferred vessel, brought about for high days and holidays, and it was upon the weather deck of this fine vessel that the Master and his Lady Olwenny, dressed in their finest apparel, sat in state upon golden thrones, encircled by the Master's own housecarls in full ceremonial regalia, and many of the ealdormen in their robes of office. Then there were her sister ships, the Merry Maid, the Bumblebee, the Isabella, Summer's Lease, the Dainty Dish, and the Damsel's Wish. each with a carved figurehead in the form of a beautiful maiden that hung from the prow. Upon the merry maid, attended by a company of the watch, bristling with halberds and pikes, sat the Chancellor in velvet and fur, a magnificent gold chain of office about his neck, upon which hung a huge golden key, signifying his stewardship over the city's treasury and its coffers. Likewise upon the Isabella, named after the master's gracious grandmother, attended by his factors and chief harbour stewards, and looking equally as regal, sat the provost. And these three stately and powerful men sat upon their individual ships, nodding sagely and smiling to one another in turn, while an army of serving men and women ran backwards and forwards between the vessels with gold and silver platters of all the best foods the city had to offer. Upon the damsel's wish, the oldest of the city's state vessels was arranged the women and men of the Grand Council of Esgaroth. These were a collection of lesser officials and emeritus notaries, dowagers, matrons, and superannuated merchants who oversaw the day-to-day governing of the city. Their vessel was anchored a good way back from the wharves, behind the ships of the master, the chancellor, and the provost, and the councillors sat gravely and soberly upon the deck of the damsel, each one in the customary velvet cap and silk tassel that hung down over their ear, and a scapular of office embroidered in gold thread showing the arms of the city. Just inside the walls of the haven, beside the harbour of the Sunstrig, a huge platform of hewn plank had been laid across gunwales of a great number of skiffs and nailed together to form an impromptu dancing floor. Upon this, throughout the day, the city's rosy-cheeked maids and their young gallants pranced and turned and frolicked, dancing, spinning and skipping to the rousing music of the master's musicians who played from the deck of the Bumblebee. There were players of sackbuts and shawms, pipes and tabors, fiddles and lutes, cymbals and drummers that together made such joyous music that it was hard to hear it and not simply break into dancing. These carousing youths were joined betimes by housewives and husbands whose enthusiasm was often not matched by their stamina, and all the while small children, full of the joys of the occasion, ran laughing in and out amongst the dancing legs. And while the master's musicians played and the merry youths danced, the master's housecarls, the men of the watch, the provost's men, indeed all of the city's assembled might, dressed in their various liveries, paraded about the Sunstrig to the general admiration and adulation of the crowds. Though the hour was still young when Peppercorn and company arrived at the Sunstrig, already a good deal of ale, which was easily the day's most popular commodity, had been consumed, and as a result spirits were high and rising. One of the elderly men of the Sinistral, a character known to all, who went by the name of Old Tom Penny, who it should be said had been celebrating since the early hours and had already availed himself of a skinful of ale, had declared himself Lord of Misrule. This was an ancient tradition at these celebrations, but was really nothing more than an excuse for excessive drinking and poor behaviour, usually at everyone else's expense. With a pig's bladder on a stick for his sceptre, Old Tom was entertaining himself with going about the quarter, causing all kinds of mischief, pushing unsuspecting people into the water, pulling hideous faces to make children shriek and babies cry, kicking cats, untying the painters of boats at dock, whistling at old women, and knocking the pipes from the mouths of old men who were minding their own business. In the general buzz of the day, these antics were causing much hilarity and laughter amongst those not on the receiving end of his chaotic capers, and much consternation and vexation amongst those who were. In this way did Old Tom deal with all those who did not or would not give him alms of food and drink, especially drink. Out on the lake beyond, south of the city, children paddled coracles, making sport upon the water, rowing ketches and sailing small dinghies up and down all day long, enjoying the sheer freedom of the feast day. Living as they did, but feet above the surface of the long lake, the children of Esgaroth were often more at home on the water than on dry land. Fishwives in small punts busied themselves up and down between the bigger boats and launches, selling their festival day treats of hot cakes and pastries, candies and sweetmeats. Brewers and alewives did likewise, with barrels of ale and porter lashed carefully at the backs of their rowboats. Indeed, all manner of foods for feast and festival could be enjoyed on the master's birthday. Candied fruits, marchpanes and sugar pastes, pastries and spiced cakes, pies and pasties, ale, wine, cider and perry, all served to make the occasion that bit more convivial, and all enthusiastically consumed by the folk of the city, gluttons and slow bellies all. In this manner did Peppercorn, Baldwin, Cresson, Nichol, Dimmock, Giles and Elissander, and at various times various of the Laidlaws, pass the morning, enjoying the sights and sounds of the celebrations. "I am not as young as once I was," Elissander had announced halfway through the morning. "I am more suited to observing festivities than to joining in." Peppercorn thought this was less to do with old age and more to do with a run-in with Old Tom, who had knocked off Elissander's tall hat with his sceptre, sending it into the canal from whence he had to fish it out with his staff. But still, regardless of the jovial protests of his young companions, the mage took himself off to find a quieter and safer spot in the Knotted Worm on Peterkin's Bridge. And so the young friends continued their revelling without him, strolling the boardwalks around the Weft and the Sunstreak, taking in the sights and sounds, dancing and laughing, rollicking and cavorting, and not until midday did they pause for breath, having built up something of an appetite. Here they would need Elisande once more, being as they were without any money for food or drink. There had been no opportunity as yet, since their early arrival in Laketown, to convert any of their treasure to coin, and though they were in reality rich beyond imagination, until they could do so they were still poor, penniless orphans. And so they began their search for the mage. They had not been looking for long, nor had they had to search very far before they found him at the market square on Navigation Bar, dancing, would you believe, with the widow Kathleen, who sold bloaters at Barrow Market and had something of a twinkle in her eye when the boys finally found them. She insisted, the mage protested breathlessly, seeing the boys' raised and questioning eyebrows. I had no choice. But seeing the sweat he had worked up and the flush of colour in his ancient cheeks, they found themselves inclined to believe this story even less than they had believed his tales of dragons and dwarves. Courteously, Elisande begged the widow's pardon, then off they set, on the hunt for a suitable establishment in which to take their midday meal. This was not such a wearisome task, for the city's harbours each had more than their fair share of taverns. The work of landing fish, of hoisting crates and bales, and of maintaining a boat was thirsty work, and upon the master's birthday all such establishments were open for business, and all were full to the rafters. They finally settled upon a large tavern named the Runishman's Head, where they entered beneath the carved wooden effigy of a rather splendid-looking Runish merchant, his polished skin oiled to the colour of a ripe chestnut, bright white eyes and teeth of polished bone, and his ebony hair entwined within a carved white turban. This particular hostelry was one of several that overlooked the waters of the haven, from whence Elisande determined they could eat their meal while still taking in the festivities. Like all the taverns of the Sunstreak, and the whole of the southern city for that matter, the Runishman's Head was heaving with customers, and people squeezed into every space, at every bench and table, and into every nook and alcove where a body could sit and eat and drink. People stood in groups, greeting and laughing and slapping backs. People called out for service, for stew or ale, and serving boys and girls wove their ways deftly through the press. And the various rooms of the tavern swam with people, the tempting aromas of food and drink, and the loud and joyful singing of holiday songs. Elisande and his friends elbowed their way into benches at an already crowded table, eliciting good-natured cheers and howls from its occupiers, with the exception of two surly-looking men who sat opposite them, who did not speak or smile but simply shuffled along to make them space. They did not look like they were in much of a holiday mood at all, these men. Indeed, their clothing looked travel-worn and dusty, while they themselves looked dispirited, and they ate their meal of bread and cheese as if it were a chore. The boys, on the other hand, ate lustily, a hot dinner of boiled potatoes and potted meat, for which Mistress Sheepwash, the landlady of the establishment, assured them she was renowned. Exactly what meat it was no one knew. It could have been dog for all anyone cared, for it tasted good and was cooked to perfection. And they washed it down with pints of old tankard, and while they ate their fill, a party in the corner sang The Bold Fisherman, and they all joined in on the last verse when they sang, I will take you to my father's hall, and there make you my bride. Then you will have a fisherman to row you on the tide, to row you on the tide. Everyone cheered at the end of the song, and many a new cry went up for this song or that song until another round of singing broke out. What news of the world beyond the Long Lake, friend? Asked Elisande at length of one of the dour-looking men who sat across from them. The man answered that they had travelled on foot from Eastbite, where lay their village, way off to the south. Some weeks ago a band of orcs had attacked their village, and a great struggle ensued until the orcs were finally driven off, but not before many of their menfolk were slain and most of their village burned. Orcs are craven and cowardly creatures, said Elisande, shaking his head, who depend on their strength in numbers and a cruel whip to give them courage. It would appear that in your case they had numbers but no whip. And a good job too, added the man. Had it not been so, I fear we would not have lived to share the tale of it. Peppercorn knew very little of orcs. He had heard tell of orcs coming along the land bridge to the Basil Gate, lone orcs begging alms, but they were always given short shrift and chased away with a few arrows. He had seen but few orcs for himself, other than in his nightmares. And what brings you now to Laketown? Asked Cresson of the man of Eastbite. We have come from our chieftain, Elfleg, to beg help of the master, said the second man, that he might send soldiers for our support, lest the orcs should rally and return. And what did the master say when he heard of the orcs? Asked Peppercorn. He has not heard, the man replied bitterly, for he would not see us, nor hear our tale. No, we will go instead to the men of South Harbour to see if they will throw in their lot with ours, for the orcs will as like go there as return to Eastbite. We begin our return journey on the morrow when the city gates are once again open." "That is bad news indeed," said Elissander, "but I fear there are no fighting men at South Harbour, only fishermen and basket weavers. I know this to be so, for I rested there on my journey north. Still, there is strength in numbers, or so they say, though I do not doubt a company of knights would not go amiss. Anyway, I wish you luck of your errand." "And I thank you for it," said the first man flatly, "for your good wishes are all the comfort we have had from our neighbours in Laketown." And so saying, the visitors returned to the business of their cheerless repast. The boys continued with their meal, and when they had finished, their plates mopped clean of food, their mugs drained of ale, Elissander excused himself and went off to pay. Indeed, he was just settling the bill with Mistress Sheepwash and complimenting her on the excellent quality of her fare, when the boys became aware of something of a commotion over near the main door. Thinking perhaps it was old Tom, come once more to wreak havoc amongst the midday diners, they stood and craned their necks in order to enjoy the spectacle. "It's Allard," said Nicholl in surprise, pointing toward the tumult, and sure enough there was young Allard Laidlaw, red in the face, running with sweat and breathing heavily, pushing his way through the lunchtime crowd. "What is amiss?" Peppercorn asked, once his friend had finally made his way through to where they stood. "Pepper," he panted, catching his breath and wiping a sleeve across his brow, "I've looked all over Laketown for you. Mother says you've to come back to the roost right away. There's trouble with the provost men." So saying, he took up one of the tankards that sat upon the long table, drained it in a single draught, and then, without further explanation, turned on his heels and headed out through the crowds back toward the roost. The storehouse of Laidlaw and Sons was on the edge of the postern beyond the hill. It was not so very far from the meal gate, only a modest walk really, if you know the quickest ways to go. Peppercorn and his boys did indeed know the quickest way, and so off they set in hot pursuit of Allard, hurrying along the boardwalk, stopping every so often in order for Elissander to catch them up, each of them unsure of what they would find once they got there. They arrived at the Goad Bridge a little out of breath, to a scene of great excitement and not an inconsiderable clamour. Ordinarily, this time of a weekday, the broad jetty outside the roost would have been busy with the industry of the Laidlaw boys and those few trusted individuals who were in the skipper's employ. The gates would be open and the yard and boards beyond would be stacked high with barrels and crates, bales and boxes of all the goods that Master Laidlaw and his family were trading. Today the gates of the yard were closed tight, and Peppercorn didn't doubt, barred from the inside, making the roost into a not unformidable fortress. The fence that enclosed it was high and the gates thick and well braced, just as the doors of the main warehouse were. The skipper had made sure of this, for he stored all his goods in the main storerooms of the roost, and so it needed to be fast and secure. The skipper's trade boat, the Hazel Rig, which was ordinarily a hive of activity of a weekday morning, was moored at the wharves before the yard, while the Farthing and the Periwinkle, the skiff that the skipper owned for transporting goods through the city's canals, lay idly at their berths. Stood before the gate with their backs to it were the skipper, the missus, and 5 of the 7 sons, Farron, Byram, Ulrich, Follis and Allard, who had run all his way back from the Sunstreak to rejoin his brothers. Each one was armed with a club or else a cudgel of some kind, with the exception of Follis, the skipper's youngest boy, who stood close by beside his father. The missus was there too, brandishing a heavy rolling pin in a very menacing way, while beside her, similarly armed with impromptu weapons, were Hinks and Hob. Even Hildreth, who it has to be said was a good deal past her brawling years, was out upon the landing, brandishing a leg of mutton which she had been rubbing with salt and rosemary when first she had been alerted to the trouble, and without a second thought had come running. Facing the Laidlaws, with their backs to the bridge, looking equally agitated, was a troop of the provost's men, 6 in number, each one dressed in the black and each brandishing a bludgeon of their own. It was a great surprise to Peppercorn to see that these men were not parading at the Sunstreak, enjoying the adulation of the feast-day crowds with the rest of their companions. Several, Peppercorn noted, did not look comfortable with their clubs, for they were not accustomed to having to resort to physical force, but nor, for that matter, were they accustomed to being defied in their duties. But surprise turned very quickly to dread when he realised just who it was that led the provostmen and stood now at the fore, nose to nose with the skipper, a man Peppercorn knew well and hated even more, and for good reason, Frumagard Breakwater. Master Breakwater was one of the provost's 5 factors, 5 men of influence and standing who oversaw the comings and goings at the city's 5 water gates, ensuring that correct excise were levied on all goods coming in and out of Laketown. His was a face known throughout the city, and a particularly obnoxious one to merchants and tradesmen alike, and to the fishermen of the postern especially, whose gates and wharves were his personal domain. Known not only because of his rather long, hooked nose, which had earned him the nickname of Beaky Breakwater, nor for his rather rude and imperious manner, but for the way he ruled the wolves with something akin to tyranny. Then Peppercorn noticed something else, something that made his blood run suddenly cold. Stood beside the factor on his right hand was a figure that he had mistaken at first for just another of the provost men. Like his companions, he was dressed all in black with a short cape, but on closer inspection he noticed the figure wore a pointed hat, tall black boots and a pair of swords upon his black belt. With his back to them, Peppercorn could not see his features, but now that he saw the manner of his attire, he did not need to see his face to know it was concealed behind a black veil. Peppercorn looked to Elisande and could see that he too had noticed the man and marked him as one of those who had tried, only hours before, to steal the treasure. And so these two groups faced each other, the Laidlaws on one side and the provostman on the other. And all the while the air was filled with a terrible barking and growling, a clamour coming from the direction of the Hazel Rig, for Ulfa, the skipper's dog, who lived aboard the Hazel Rig, had heard the commotion unfolding upon the landing and, sensing the contentious nature of the embroilment, and not wanting to miss out on the fun, had set up a loud and plaintive hoo-ha in way of accompaniment. It was at this point, too, that the last of the skipper's boys came charging down the boardwalks of Jenner's Row, followed closely by a red-faced and panting Jesper who had been sent off by the skipper to find and fetch the boys home. If you remember, Finian and Furman had gone early that morning, keen to be part of the holiday carousing and festivities. When Jesper had found them, as predicted, at the Dragon and Duck, he had hurriedly told them of the events unfolding at the Roost, and they had all three hastened back there, much to the displeasure of the coquettish sisters who were enjoying the attentions of the Laidlaw brothers. "I will ask you one last time," Master Frummagar was demanding as they approached the scene. "Stand aside and allow us to exercise our appointed duty." "And I ask you one more time," replied the skipper in an equally determined tone, "by what authority do ye come a-barging into a man's home and trampling all over his place of refuge and sanctuary?" "By my Lord Provost's authority, as I have already explained, and you well know," replied Master Breakwater in a voice of exasperation. "You may well march into other folks' homes without so much as a by your leave, but you shan't do it in this one. You have no jurisdiction here, Beaky Breakwater, proctor or otherwise," said the skipper firmly. "My accounts are carefully kept and all my taxes receipted at the monument, so any role you play ends at my front door, from the vicinity of which I would thank you to take your leave. A Laketown man's home is his castle, and you disregard that at your peril." "If you will not stand aside," the factor was saying, as Peppercorn approached, "and allow us to exercise our duties, we will be forced to use physical constraint to execute our charge." "If you'll not clear off out of here and leave my family be," interjected the missus, who hadn't caught everything the factor had said, but did not much care for the word execute, "I will have no choice but to introduce your head to my rolling pin." And she raised it high above her own head in case there was anyone in doubt as to just how formidable a weapon a good rolling pin could be. It was plain to see that it was going to be difficult to settle this amicably and to avoid bloodshed. Hastening forward, Elisande hurried to come between the skipper and Master Breakwater, who were squared up to one another like a pair of gamecocks ready to do battle. He was followed closely by Peppercorn and his crew. Sensing their approach, Master Breakwater and the man beside him turned, and Peppercorn was met by a pair of dark eyes above a black veil that fixed him in their stare and seemed to burn into his very soul, as if he was being searched inside and out. "Ah," said Master Breakwater suddenly, seeing Peppercorn for the first time, "here is the boy we seek. The rest of you may go about your business." Needless to say, no one moved and no one went about their business, but waited to hear what the factor had to say to the boy and what the boy would say in turn. "We have it on good authority that you are contrabanding there," Master Breakwater said, addressing Peppercorn, but still indicating the Roost. "Taxable items upon which no duty has been paid." The veiled man leaned in close to Master Breakwater, whispering something behind his hand. Peppercorn wondered if this was one of those he had chased the previous night, whether it was the man or the woman, and whether they knew yet what had become of their friend, whom Elisande had slain and who now lay at the bottom of the lake. "I have heard rumours, boy," the factor continued. "Nothing much believable, mind." Near inclined his head slightly toward the man in black. "Some nonsense about wizards and dragons, and what interests me more, something about treasure, gold and silver and the like. And you'll understand, you being a bright and intelligent young man, that whilst I don't necessarily put no stock in such gossip, I would be neglectful in my duties if I did not determine the veracity of such stories and pursue the master's and the city's interest in such affairs." The factor had an uncanny and practised way of speaking affably, but with an underlying and unveiled menace. "And what business is it of the city?" asked Peppercorn with a note of hostility reserved for all figures of authority, and especially the provost and his excisemen. "And what business of the master, for that matter?" "Might be you're a smuggler," suggested Master Breakwater, "and you are trying to avoid paying the master what is his lawful due. and he stressed the word lawful as if it justified robbing honest men of their livelihood every time they landed a catch or unloaded a cargo. Of course, continued Master Breakwater, we would all be glad for you to come into such a fortune, but then there would be the small matter of taxes, 25% in the first instance and 50% on anything over a ton in weight to be exact. That's daylight robbery, exclaimed Nickel. That's the law, the proctor snapped, turning angrily upon the boy, his pretense of affability melting suddenly away. And you would do well not only to remember it, but also the jail cells full of those as tried to get away without paying it. He paused and regained his composure. A great city like ours don't run itself, you know. If you want to live here, he concluded, you have to pay your fair share. Well, perhaps I won't live here then, retorted Peppercorn unguardedly. Ah, so the rumours are true, are they? Retorted the factor greedily, his eyes widening and a grin curling the corners of his mouth. You have got some treasure. I'm not saying I have, and I'm not saying I haven't, replied Peppercorn a little too bluntly. All I'm saying is, if I come into any money, then it's mine, and you are not getting any of it. We'll see about that, rejoined the factor. Now, let us in, or I will have my men break these gates down. The master will hear of this, cried the skipper. I am not without influence in this city. Carrying on like this, it was not long before they drew the attention of some men of the watch, who happened to be passing on the other side of the canal, 4 of them to be exact, on their way to the weft to enjoy the day's festivities. Burly men they were, dressed in the purple livery of the Chancellor, the symbol of the white portcullis upon their chests, and each one bearing a halberd, as was the custom with their order. By this time, Master Breakwater had worked himself into something of a right old froth, as the missus would later tell it, his temper sorely frayed, and by but a thread away from snapping completely. Seeing the men of the watch approaching along the walkway, and assuming they would add weight to his authority, he called out, Here, you men of the watch, lend a hand, will you? We have important provost business to be about, and this man and his family will insist on obstructing us in our duty. Now, you might be surprised to learn, but the men of the watch, being as they were the Chancellor's men, did not always see eye to eye with the provost's men. Indeed, the men of the watch harboured something of a long-standing antipathy for the provost's men, they being rather jealous of their greater opportunity for making money through bribes and inducements around the harbours, not to mention resenting the thick black hoods of oiled flax that the provost provided for each of the men of his service. The men of the watch argued that they too needed protection from the elements, more so even than the provost's men, since they were on patrol both day and night. But the watch received no such garment from their patron, and when the wind howled from off the long lake and the rain teemed, they had simply to grin and bear it, as the saying goes, and look for whatever shelter they could find. And especially disliked of the men of the watch was old Beaky Breakwater. And what duty might that be? Asked the captain of the watch, a man by the name of Nicklin, who spoke in a tone that Master Breakwater straightway took for insolence. To search this here establishment, explained Master Breakwater. To trample roughshod all over my clean floors, contradicted the missus, slapping the rolling pin once more into the palm of her hand. Having heard quite enough of this back and forth, it had become clear to Peppercorn that they were at something of an impasse or deadlock. Call it what you will, Master Breakwater, they all knew, would not back down. He could not without skulking off like a dog with its tail between his legs, losing face in front of his subordinates, and no more would the skipper give in, not while there was still breath in his body. He paid what was his due, and he wasn't going to let the provost's men take a liberty with him and his. By now the air was thick, the atmosphere tense, and they all tottered, Peppercorn could see, upon the brink of violence. He had to do something if his friends were to be saved this inconvenience and humiliation, and if he were to save any of the dragon treasure they had so far managed to collect. Instantly a number of scenarios played themselves out in his head. First, one in which the Laidlaws all found themselves locked up in the Sinistral, or worse, shipped off to one of the Master's prison hulks. The hulks were always referred to as the Master's in order to emphasise his power and the consequence of crossing him. Then a second where Master Breakwater and his men scoured the roost, turning the place upside down, breaking open casks of wine, spilling sacks of grain, spoiling the skipper's wares, not to mention dirtying up the missus' floors, then taking all the dragon treasure for themselves. It wouldn't do, Peppercorn thought, to be that close to having the money to buy a home for him and his boys, only to have it snatched away at the last minute. But what could he do? This man says he's paid all his taxes, the captain of the watch was saying, pointing at the skipper. Got all the paperwork to prove it, added the skipper, beginning to sense that the men of the watch were not going to help the provost men, and the outside chance of their actually being sympathetic to his cause and the injustice of Master Breakwater's demands. I don't care what he says, snapped Master Breakwater, more than a little discourteously, his exasperation getting the better of him. I have my orders, and you would be wise to lend a hand rather than interfering with them. Not surprisingly, the captain of the watch, he being a figure of authority in his own right, did not take kindly to being spoken to in this way, nor did the rest of his men like to hear their captain addressed so, especially not by one of the provost's men towards whom, as I have already explained, they bore certain prejudices. I don't know who you think you are, said the disgruntled captain, taking a step toward Master Breakwater, a step that could easily have been described as menacing. But you are not on the wharves now. You might be top dog around the harbours and the customs houses, but here on the towpaths things take an altogether different order. It was at this point that the veiled man stepped forward, having stayed out of things until now, and taking the captain by the elbow, he leaned in close, intimately close considering they were strangers, and pressing his mouth against the captain's ear, whispered something through his veil. What the veiled man told the captain, no one knew, for they could not hear his muttered words. Whether he spoke words of magic or threat was of no real consequence, for the result was the same. Instantly the blood drained from Master Nickling's face, and he turned to his men, not looking at all as bumptious as he had done before, and, pointing at the skipper and those who stood beside him, said, "Right, you men, get these rowdies out of the way so that the good factor may go about his duty." And that's when all hell broke loose. What followed was a full-blown brawl. Clubs and rolling pins were brandished, along with elbows, knees and fists. Heads were cracked, eyes poked, hair and beards pulled, ears bitten, toes stamped upon and stomachs winded. Indeed, none of those involved in the ensuing fracas escaped unscathed. Had you been witness to these events, you could have been forgiven for thinking that the men of the provost's office did not seem over-eager for the dispute to turn to violence. They waded into the fray readily enough, their clubs flailing, but not actually landing many blows. They were not accustomed to having their authority questioned or their orders resisted, and Peppercorn realised were equally unaccustomed to having to follow up their threats and intimidations with violence. Indeed, the lion's share of the brawling was being done by the men of the watch, whilst there was a great deal more shouting and bellowing, bravado and bluster coming from the provostmen than the landing of blows. Elisandra, on the other hand, was something of a dark horse, for he moved with a freedom and liveliness that belied his age. He employed both sword and staff with skill and agility, disarming, parrying and striking in a whirl of clouts and clobbers. And though he used only the flat of his sword upon the arms and rumps of his adversaries, inflicting bruises rather than wounds, it was obvious not only to Peppercorn, but to all those who witnessed it, that should he choose to be, Elisandra was deadly with the sword. Nor was Master Breakwater as dainty, nor as reticent as his comrades, and in the heat of the scuffle managed to land the skipper quite a wallop on the front of his head, just above the eye, precipitating a surprising amount of blood that both dismayed and enraged the missus in equal measure. She in turn employed her rolling pin, first upon Master Breakwater's noggin, and then upon the helmeted heads of any of his underlings, not to mention any of the men of the watch. Indeed, any who fell within reach of it, setting up a din, as Baldwin later put it, to rival the drumming band of the Guild of Blacksmiths. Despite all the missus' efforts, and regardless of the efforts of Peppercorn and the boys of the Farthing, not to mention the Laidlaw brothers, who were in no wise backward when it came to a bit of a fight, they were sadly outnumbered. It was soon apparent that it was only a matter of time before they would have to submit, not only to the greater force of the provostmen and the watchmen, but to Master Breakwater's demands to be granted admittance to the roost, and then began a very timely turn of events. It was not unusual, what with the amounts of ale and wine that were annually consumed, for the master's feast day to be punctuated here and there with the odd friendly tussle or good-natured brawl, and so this one drew little more attention than the odd cry of encouragement from passers-by, mostly in favour of the Laidlaws, it should be said. That is, until old Tom Penny, self-appointed Lord of Misrule, stumbled upon the fray while still in full swing. Seeing the blood and bruises already inflicted on both parts, and seeing an opportunity to have a poke at the authorities, as he later put it, he decided it looked altogether too much fun to pass up. So, with bladdered sceptre in hand, brandished now like a war-hammer, and soused as he was like a summer herring, in he piled with cries of, "Here's one in the eye for the provost," and "Try collecting the tax on this un," before landing a thump squarely upon Master Breakwater's already bloody beak. And once old Thomas had added his penny's worth, it was not long before something of a free-for-all had broken out, with men and women alike coming across bridges and from all directions to join in the post-luncheon sport. For what was a Master's Day celebration after all, and what better aid to digestion than a good old punch-up? And so the fighting continued for a good many minutes more, the whole thing finally petering out when a second band of the watch were alerted to the disturbance and hastened from the sunstreak to break it up, but not before many heads were broken, eyes blackened, teeth loosened, and much blood shed, mostly from thumped noses and split brows. No one noticed in all this commotion the black-veiled man slipping away, but slip away he did, as did Elisandra at some point during the fracas, and was not seen again for a good number of days. Peppercorn, on the other hand, the skipper, and old Tom Penny were taken all three by the men of the watch, cutting short old Tom's glorious reign of misrule. Though he was not seized himself, Follis followed along, for he would not be parted from his father, and Ulrich too, on his mother's instruction, tagged along to see where exactly they were taking them. Through the city they marched, turning heads wherever they passed, northward to the Sinistral and the guardhouse, all the while old Beaky Breakwater scurrying along beside them, his long nose red and sore and glistening with blood, complaining to any who would listen, and many who would not, of the reception he had received of the skipper and his unruly family at the Roost. Dimmock and the rest of Peppercorn's crew returned with the missus and her boys to the kitchen at the Roost, where hot water, soft cloth and bandages were laid out upon the long table, and the missus and Hildreth cleaned and bound up their many wounds. Baldwin betook himself first to the Farthing, moored still in the shadow of the hazel rig, before the gates of the Roost, only to find that it had been ransacked, turned upside down no less. Someone had been looking for something, and it didn't look as if they had found it. No prizes were awarded for guessing who had done it, nor for what it was they had been hoping to find, and they each took comfort in the knowledge that the barrels of treasure lay secure in the depths of the skipper's storehouse. Each year, the climax of the day's festivities was what the folk of Laketown called the Array of Lights, and this year was to be no different. As the sun sank beyond the western horizon, lanterns were lit and hung from every prow and mast, and from the yard arm of every boat or vessel, lighting up the lake's surface. Meanwhile, a fusillade of fireworks was sent up from the decks of the master's state ships, showering the city in a shimmer of twinkling light, the explosions re-echoing in the terrible crescendo of the basilisk's salute, fired from their position atop the naysayer's tower. The rooftops around the hill were showered with fire and flame until the night sky was aglow with 1,000 lights and fire bursts that equalled in number the multitude of stars and their many constellations, each one reflected in turn in the lake's black surface. Each year, the children and adults alike looked forward to this part of the celebrations, for the lanterns and fireworks and the storm of flame that belched from the naysayer's tower truly was a marvellous spectacle, a magical way to end a day of feasting and celebration. But not everyone's thoughts were consumed on this occasion with such wonders and frivolities. Try as he might to enjoy the show, Baldwin missed his friend and could not help wondering how much, if any of it, Peppercorn could see from wherever he had been taken. Baldwin had always loved the fireworks and the thunder and flame of the basilisks, but Peppercorn had often commented on how much gold it would have cost to create such a display. "Squandered all on a trifle," he would say, "when we and others like us are hungry and cold and will sleep tonight beneath the open skies." And each year, once the sparks and thunderclaps had died down and the candles in the myriad lanterns had guttered, they would indeed sleep beneath the empty skies, swaddled in the smoke that lingered upon the water's black surface and drafted about the city's towpaths. In Peppercorn's and Elisander's absence, Dimmock had decided they should move the Farthing away from the Roost, where it had attracted unwanted attention, back to the postern, to her usual mooring place. And so this year they slept in their hammocks below deck, worrying and wondering what had become of their captain, each one cradling a knife or a hatchet or a spar end as bedfellow. Some in Laketown that night remained in the shadows, hidden from the attentions of the revellers, stealing about the near abandoned city, avoiding the men of the watch who had been posted to guard the empty streets. Questions were muffled behind blackened veils, answered whispered behind gloved hands. It was late into the night, the fireworks having finished, the lanterns snuffed out, and all but the most dedicated of revellers having found themselves a bed in which to sleep off the excesses of the day, that the cry of "Fire!" was heard to go up, first from the sunstrig and then repeated throughout the city. A warehouse was alight, and folk from all around shook off sleep and shrugged on their coats and cloaks to come and see the spectacle. Dimmock, Cresson, Giles, Nicholl and Baldwin, hearing the commotion, dressed quickly and headed from their berths aboard the Farthing to discover what was amiss. At first they could see very little, for it was night time and the public lanterns had been extinguished. Additionally, the smoke of the evening's fireworks and of the flame and fury of the basilisks had settled in a thick smog across the city. The hollow sound of raised voices drifted eerily through the gloom, some barking out orders and instructions, some issuing forth cries for help, all speaking of fire. At first they feared lest they should find it was the Roost that was ablaze. The Master Breakwater had returned in the dead of night with a fiery brand and a determination that one way or another he would gain entry to the warehouse. That by setting a fire in the Roost he might get his hands on the treasure that the veiled man had assured him would be there. So it was with great relief that they passed by the Roost to find the doors and windows tightly shuttered and the building unscathed by fire. On the other side of the canal, beyond the Goad Bridge, flickering lamplight moved ghostlight in the fog, hurrying along the quay, continuing southward toward the Sunstrig. Crossing the bridge, the boys of the Farthing followed behind, wending the way through smoke-filled streets and alleyways until they arrived at Horgrip Yard, where they found the conflagration. an orange glow of flame that silhouetted the harbour's watchtower. They remained at a safe distance, along with many other onlookers, the glow of the fire reflected not only in the nighttime surface of the lake, but upon the upturned faces that glistened in the fierce heat, and watched the work of the men of the watch, assisted by those citizens able to lend a hand. They toiled with buckets and barrels, cook-pots and wash-bowls, indeed any receptacle that could hold water, to extinguish the flames, all the while under the watchful eyes of the many onlookers, as if it were just another of the day's spectacles, the next in a line of entertainments. Once the flaming building had been doused and the fire reduced from raging to smouldering, other men came with saws and axes, and working upon the timbers that joined the burning warehouse to the surrounding buildings, they severed the struts and joists, planks and spars that held them together. Then, with long poles and many hands, they managed to heave and push the burning building, already crumbling upon its charred and blackened self, into the nighttime lake, where it broiled and hissed violently, extinguishing what remained of the flames and sending up plumes of steam to augment the smoke and mist that already cloaked the city. And though in this way the flames did not spread, news of the fire did, and it was soon whispered abroad that the warehouse in question had belonged to an irascible thief and smuggler by the name of Shillabeer. Of course, the ears of the boys of the farthing pricked up to hear that name. The fire was set, so the captain of the watch believed, to hide the fact that the property had been ransacked, for everything inside was turned upside down, the whole place having been searched, emptied out or broken in. The proprietor, it was reported, this Shillabeer himself, had been murdered before the fire even started. "How could you tell?" asked Giles of the captain. "We found the body before the fire had taken hold, and a person what dies in a fire," the captain replied with relish, "don't have his throat cut. Opened up from ear to ear he was," and he drew his thumb across his throat in a grisly reenactment. Despite all the missus' protests and her insistence that she made them up cots in the storeroom, Dimmock and company decided to spend what remained of the night back aboard the Farthing, for though no treasure or anything of value remained aboard, still they did not like the thought of strangers prying open hatches or interfering with their few belongings. And though they each slept with one eye open, as they say, and burned what Peppercorn would have called a small fortune in best candles, keeping two kindled throughout the night in the cuddy lanterns and another on the bowsprit, still they were very relieved when the morning came and there had been no visitors or incidents to speak of, apart from Baldwin's snoring. It was not unusual for candlelight to creep so late at night from between the window shutters of the parlour of the Hardy house on Seward Lane, situated in the north of the Weft, hard against the armoury. This was the home of Frumagger Breakwater, the provost's proctor. Mrs. Breakwater ran a tight household. Her husband was a man of importance and influence, and since moving into the Hardy house, a home which they could not really afford on a proctor's pay, she had been aware of her duty to keep up appearances. As such, she insisted that the household was locked and barred, all candles and lanterns extinguished to save a few pennies each day, as well as establishing an impression of propriety, and the maid, the cook, mistress and master were all abed before the public lanterns were extinguished. But on this particular night, the mistress warmed the bed-sheets alone, for Master Breakwater was not yet abed. Instead, he was burning candle wax, entertaining a late-night visitor in the small parlour that overlooked the waterway. "So you have the boy?" the visitor asked. She was dressed all in black with a tall pointed hat, all but her eyes covered over with a black veil. Though she sat in Master Breakwater's best armchair, she looked anything but at her ease. When she spoke, it was in a flat, monotone whisper that sent a chill like a southerly wind up the proctor's spine. "In a manner of speaking," Master Breakwater stammered, sounding nervous and sure of his assertion. Master Breakwater was not used to being interrogated in his own front parlour. Indeed, it was usually he who made demands of others. Yet he would endure it, for he had been warned most forcefully against crossing the veiled men in their purpose. "In a manner of speaking sounds a long way from yes," said the veiled woman. "Is he in your power or isn't he?" He's in the guardhouse, even as we speak," explained the proctor, "locked tight within a cell. He cannot help but tell us what we want." The veiled woman pinned Master Breakwater with feverish, red-rimmed eyes, as surely as if he were upon the point of one of her two needle-like swords, and the proctor shifted uncomfortably beneath such piercing scrutiny. "I hope for your sake that you are correct," hissed the woman in a tone of agitation. Master Breakwater did not answer, but swallowed hard, a nervous sweat breaking out upon his newly grazed and bruised brow. "I will go to the guardhouse first thing in the morning," Master Breakwater assured, "and make him an offer he can't refuse. Then he will speak, or I will have him locked away where no one will find him." "Be warned," the veiled woman said, in still a flat but menacing tone. "If you cannot make the boy talk, you may lose more than your precious treasure." Having reached its natural conclusion, the conversation continued for only a minute more before the veiled woman announced her intention of drawing the conference to an end. Letting her out through the street door, she seemed to flux like liquid into the shadows of Seward Lane and disappeared into the Laketown night. Closing fast the door behind her, Master Breakwater quickly shot the bolts in their catches and turned with his back against the door, relieved by her eventual absence. When Allard came aboard the Farthing a little after sunrise with an invitation from the missus that they come to the Roost for breakfast, they were happy to accept her kindness and hospitality, and so it was in the kitchen, sat once more around the long table and basking in the delicious aromas of the missus' baking, that they learned that Peppercorn was in the guardhouse. Ulrich had followed his father and those others who had been taken by the watch, as he had been instructed, and had seen Peppercorn go in through the thick doors, but not come back out again. The skipper, on the other hand, and old Tom had been released almost as soon as they had reached the guardhouse, though not before both had been issued with a fine of a silver penny, and old Tom's bladder sceptre had been confiscated. "Well, at least he wasn't taken straight to one of the master's hulks, thank Anor," said Dimmock, trying to find a silver lining. Baldwin was not feeling quite so assured about his friend's prospects. "We need to do something," he said. "We can't just leave him there to rot." "You needn't waste your time worrying over how to free him," said the skipper. "Not from the guardhouse. You'll only end up getting yourselves a cell next to his. No, Peppercorn's a wily one and can take care of himself. You're going to have to trust him to employ that cunning and cleverness that has long kept him and you all alive for so long." They knew that the skipper was talking sense, but did not like the idea of sitting around idly while their friend was locked up in the guardhouse. "We'll get the Farthing prepared once more for sailing," said Dimmock, assuming his role of first mate and taking command in the absence of their captain. "There's some repairs that need doing, not to mention some cleaning up, if we're to get back out on the lake once Peppercorn's back. We'll need to replenish our provisions and clean water, and we'll need some more barrels in the hold." And so, with many words of thanks to the missus and Hildreth for their breakfast and to the skipper for his hospitality, off they headed, back to the quayside where the Farthing was berthed. Of course, they were more concerned for the well-being of their friend and leader than they were for his boat, but for now his fate was out of their hands. Busying themselves aboard the Farthing would take their mind from off their precarious situation and their fears for Peppercorn. They were equally concerned, if not a little annoyed, for the strange and unexplained disappearance of Elisander. He had not struck them as the type to flee at the first signs of trouble, nor to leave his young companions to fend for themselves, not to mention forfeiting any chance of retrieving his precious talisman. Still, a job is often done better when a body has something to mull over while they work, and so, with thoughts of Peppercorn and Elisander uppermost in their minds, the boys of the Farthing bent their efforts to the job at hand. By the end of the day, their work was complete. All repairs had been made and the Farthing was once more lake-worthy. The skipper had loaned them some money, enough for provisions. Having seen their barrels of treasure, he knew they were good for it. And a trip north to the Sinistral saw Baldwin and Nichol trotting backward and forward between the Hope and Anchor and the Farthing until there were 10 more barrels lashed down in the hold, ready to receive their treasure. Now all they lacked was a captain. It was early evening when Giles untied the Farthing's mooring line and jumped aboard, and Baldwin poled them away from Butler's Lock, while Dimmock navigated them through the city to the postern, heading eastward toward the Troll Gate and their regular mooring spot. They were happy to be once more under sail, feeling the movement of the lake beneath them, but their mood was sombre and subdued, for they each felt Peppercorn's absence. "We will wait here," instructed Dimmock as they tied the Farthing off to the standing post, "and we will be ready to leave once Peppercorn is returned."